The Roman army is a term encompassing the terrestrial armed forces deployed by the Roman Kingdom, the Roman Republic, the Roman Empire and its successor, the East Roman or Byzantine Empire. It is thus a term that spans approximately 2,000 years, during which the Roman armed forces underwent numerous permutations in composition, organization, equipment and tactics, while conserving a core of lasting traditions. Historical phases. The development of the Roman army was divided into 8 phases. Early Roman army. The early Roman army of the Roman Kingdom and of the early Republic. During this period, when warfare chiefly consisted of small-scale plundering raids, it has been suggested that the Roman army followed Etruscan or Greek models of organization and equipment. The early Roman army was based on an annual levy. The infantry ranks were filled with the lower classes, while the cavalry, equites or celeres, were left to the patricians. This was done so because the wealthier could afford horses. Moreover, the commanding authority during the regal period was the High King. Until the establishment of the Republic, as well as the consuls, the king assumed the role of commander-in-chief. However, in 508 BC, Rome no longer had a king. The commanding position of the army was given to the consuls, who were charged both singly and jointly to take care to preserve the republic from danger. The term legion is derived from the Latin word legio, which ultimately means draft or levy. At first there were only 4 legions. These legions were numbered I to 4, with the 4th being written as such and not IV. The first legion was seen as the most prestigious, the latter being a recurring theme in many elements of the Roman army. As mentioned before, the bulk of the army was citizens. These citizens did not get to choose which legion they wanted to be in. Any man, from ages 16 to 46, were selected by ballot, and assigned to a legion. Up until the Roman military disaster of 390 BC, at the Battle of Allia, Rome's army was organized in similarity to the Greek phalanx. This was due to Greek influence in Italy, by way of their colonies. Patricia Southern quotes ancient historians Livy and Dionysius in saying that the phalanx consisted of 3,000 infantry and 300 cavalry. Each man had to provide his equipment in battle. This determined which position he would be situated in the battle by the purchasing power of his military equipment. Politically, they shared the same ranking system in the Comitia Centuriata, which ultimately vis-a-vis placed the men on the battlefield. Roman army of the mid-Republic. The Roman army of the mid-Republic of the mid-Republican period. During this period, the Romans, while maintaining the levy system, adopted the Samnite Manipular organization for their legions and also bound all the other peninsular Italian states into a permanent military alliance. The latter were required to supply roughly the same number of troops to joint forces as the Romans to serve under Roman command. Legions in this phase were always accompanied on campaign by the same number of allied units of roughly the same size as legions. After the Second Punic War, the Romans acquired an overseas empire, which necessitated standing forces to fight lengthy wars of conquest and to garrison the newly gained provinces. Thus the army's character mutated from a temporary force based entirely on short-term conscription to a standing army in which the conscripts were complemented by a large number of volunteers willing to serve for much longer than the legal 6-year limit. These volunteers were mainly from the poorest social class, who did not have plots to tend at home and were attracted by the modest military pay and the prospect of a share of war booty. The minimum property requirement for service in the legions, which had been suspended during the Second Punic War, was effectively ignored from 201 BC onward in order to recruit sufficient volunteers. During this period 150–100 BC, the manipular structure was gradually phased out, and the much larger cohort became the main tactical unit. In addition, from the Second Punic War onward, Roman armies were always accompanied by units of non-Italian mercenaries, Numidian light cavalry, Cretan archers, and Balearic slingers, who provided specialist functions that Roman armies had previously lacked. Roman Army of the Late Republic. The Roman Army of the Late Republic marks the continued transition between the conscription-based citizen levy of the Mid-Republic and the mainly volunteer, professional standing forces of the imperial era. The main literary source for the army's organization and tactics in this phase are the works of Julius Caesar, the most notable of a series of warlords who contested for power in this period. As a result of the social war, all Italians were granted Roman citizenship. The old allied arli were abolished and their members integrated into the legions. Regular annual conscription remained in force and continued to provide the core of legionary recruitment. But an ever-increasing proportion of recruits were volunteers, who signed up for 16-year terms as opposed to the maximum 6 years for conscripts. The loss of Legionary Cavalry reduced Roman, Italian cavalry by 75%, and legions became dependent on allied native horse for cavalry cover. This period saw the large-scale expansion of native forces employed to complement the legions, made up of numeri recruited from tribes within Rome's overseas empire and neighboring allied tribes. Large numbers of heavy infantry and cavalry were recruited in Spain, Gaul and Thrace, and archers in Thrace, Anatolia and Syria. However, these native units were not integrated with the legions, but retained their own traditional leadership, organization, armor and weapons. Imperial Roman Army. The Imperial Roman Army, when the republican system of citizen conscription was replaced by a standing professional army of mainly volunteers serving standard 20-year terms. The legions, consisting almost entirely of heavy infantry, numbered 25 of about 5,000 men each under Augustus, increasing to a peak of 33 of about 5,500 by 200 AD under Septimius Severus. Legions continued to recruit Roman citizens, mainly the inhabitants of Italy and Roman colonies until 212 AD. Regular annual conscription of citizens was abandoned and only decreed in emergencies. Legions were now flanked by the auxilia, a corps of regular troops recruited mainly from peregrini, imperial subjects who did not hold Roman citizenship. Auxiliaries, who served a minimum term of 25 years, were also mainly volunteers, but regular conscription of peregrini was employed for most of the 1st century AD. The auxilia consisted, under Augustus, of about 250 regiments of roughly cohort size, that is, about 500 men. The number of regiments increased to about 400 under Severus, of which about 13% were double strength. Auxilia contained heavy infantry equipped similarly to legionaries, and almost all the army's cavalry, and archers and slingers. Late Roman Army. Continuing as East Roman Army. The Late Roman Army, in this phase, crystallized by the reforms of the Emperor Diocletian, the Roman army returned to regular annual conscription of citizens, while admitting large numbers of non-citizen barbarian volunteers. However, soldiers remained 25-year professionals and did not return to the short-term levies of the Republic. The old dual organization of legions and auxilia was abandoned, with citizens and non-citizens now serving in the same units. The old legions were broken up into cohorts or even smaller sizes. At the same time, a substantial proportion of the army's effectives were stationed in the interior of the empire, in the form of comitatus praesentiales, armies that escorted the emperors. Middle Byzantine Army. The Middle Byzantine Army is the army of the Byzantine state in its classical form. This army was based on conscription of professional troops in the themes structure characteristic of this period, and from about 950 AD on the professional troops known as tagmata. Komnenian Byzantine Army. The Komnenian Byzantine Army, named after the Komnenos dynasty, which ruled in 1081 to 1185. This was an army built virtually from scratch after the permanent loss of Byzantium's traditional main recruiting ground of Anatolia to the Turks. following the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, and the destruction of the last regiments of the Old Army in the wars against the Normans in the early 1080s. It survived until the fall of Constantinople to the Western Crusaders in 1204. This army was characterized by a large number of mercenary regiments composed of troops of foreign origin such as the Varangian Guard, and the introduction of the pronoia system. Paleologan Byzantine army. The Paleologan Byzantine army, named after the Paleologos dynasty, which ruled Byzantium between the recovery of Constantinople from the Crusaders and its fall to the Turks in 1453. Initially, it continued some practices inherited from the Komnenian era and retained a strong native element until the late 13th century. During the last century of its existence, however, the empire was little more than a city-state that hired foreign mercenary bands for its defense. Thus, the Byzantine army finally lost any meaningful connection with the standing Imperial Roman army. This article contains the summaries of the detailed linked articles on the historical phases above. Readers seeking discussion of the Roman army by theme, rather than by chronological phase, should consult the following articles. History Campaign History of the Roman military. Structural history of the Roman military. Corps Praetorian Guard, Roman Legion, Roman Auxiliaries, Roman Cavalry, Strategy and Tactics. Defense in depth, Roman Infantry Tactics, Equipment and other Roman military equipment, Roman military decorations and punishments. Some of the Roman army's many tactics are still used in modern-day armies today. Early Roman army. Until c. 550 BC, there was probably no national Roman army, but a series of clan-based war bands which only coalesced into a united force in periods of serious external threat. Around 550 BC, during the period conventionally known as the rule of King Servius Tullius, it appears that a universal levy of eligible adult male citizens was instituted. This development apparently coincided with the introduction of heavy armor for most of the infantry. Although originally low in numbers, the Roman infantry was extremely tactical and developed some of the most influential battle strategies to date. The early Roman army was based on a compulsory levy from adult male citizens which was held at the start of each campaigning season. In those years that war was declared, there were probably no standing or professional forces. During the regal era, the standard levy was probably of 9,000 men, consisting of 6,000 heavily armed infantry, plus 2,400 light armed infantry and 600 light cavalry. When the kings were replaced by two annually elected praetors in c. 500 BC, the standard levy remained of the same size, but was now divided equally between the praetors, each commanding one legion of 4,500 men. It is likely that the hoplite element was deployed in a Greek-style phalanx formation in large set-piece battles. However, these were relatively rare, with most fighting consisting of small-scale border raids and skirmishing. In these, the Romans would fight in their basic tactical unit, the centuria of 100 men. In addition, separate clan-based forces remained in existence until c. 450 BC at least, although they would operate under the praetor's authority, at least nominally. In 493 BC, shortly after the establishment of the Roman Republic, Rome concluded a perpetual treaty of military alliance with the combined other Latin city-states. The treaty, probably motivated by the need for the Latins to deploy a united defense against incursions by neighboring hill tribes, provided for each party to provide an equal force for campaigns under unified command. It remained in force until 358 BC. Roman Army of the Mid-Republic. The central feature of the Roman Army of the Mid-Republic, or the Polybian Army, was the manipular organization of its battle line. Instead of a single, large masses in the early Roman army, the Romans now drew up in three lines consisting of small units of 120 men. arrayed in chessboard fashion, giving much greater tactical strength and flexibility. This structure was probably introduced in c. 300 BC during the Samnite Wars. Also probably dating from this period was the regular accompaniment of each legion by a non-citizen formation of roughly equal size, the ala, recruited from Rome's Italian allies, or socii. The latter were c. 150 autonomous states which were bound by a treaty of perpetual military alliance with Rome. Their sole obligation was to supply to the Roman army, on demand, a number of fully equipped troops up to a specified maximum each year. The Second Punic War saw the addition of a third element to the existing dual Roman-Italian structure. Non-Italian mercenaries with specialist skills lacking in the legions and ally, Numidian light cavalry, Cretan archers, and slingers from the Balearic Islands. From this time, these units always accompanied Roman armies. The Republican army of this period, like its earlier forebear, did not maintain standing or professional military forces, but levied them by compulsory conscription, as required for each campaigning season, and disbanded thereafter. The standard levy was doubled during the Samnite Wars to 4 legions, for a total of c. 18,000 Roman troops and 4 allied alli of similar size. Service in the legions was limited to property-owning Roman citizens, normally those known as illuneers. The army's senior officers, including its commanders-in-chief, the Roman consuls, were all elected annually at the People's Assembly. Only equites were eligible to serve as senior officers. Illuneers of the highest social classes provided the legion's cavalry, the other classes the legionary infantry. The proletarii were ineligible for legionary service and were assigned to fleets as oarsmen. Elders, vagrants, freedmen, slaves and convicts were excluded from the military levy, save in emergencies. The legionary cavalry also changed, probably around 300 BC onwards, from the light, unarmored horse of the early army to a heavy force with metal armor. Contrary to a long-held view, the cavalry of the mid-republic was a highly effective force that generally prevailed against strong enemy cavalry forces until it was decisively beaten by the Carthaginian general Hannibal's horsemen during the Second Punic War. This was due to Hannibal's greater operational flexibility owing to his Numidian light cavalry. The Polybian army's operations during its existence can be divided into 3 broad phases. The struggle for hegemony over Italy, especially against the Samnite League, the struggle with Carthage for hegemony in the western Mediterranean Sea, and the struggle against the Hellenistic monarchies for control of the eastern Mediterranean. During the earlier phase, the normal size of the levy was in the region of 40,000 men. During the latter phase, with lengthy wars of conquest followed by permanent military occupation of overseas provinces, the character of the army necessarily changed from a temporary force based entirely on short-term conscription to a standing army in which the conscripts, whose service was in this period limited by law to 6 consecutive years, were complemented by large numbers of volunteers who were willing to serve for much longer periods. Many of the volunteers were drawn from the poorest social class, which until the Second Punic War had been excluded from service in the legions by the minimum property requirement. During that war, extreme manpower needs had forced the army to ignore the requirement, and this practice continued thereafter. Manipules were gradually phased out as the main tactical unit, and replaced by the larger cohorts used in the Allied ally. A process probably complete by the time that General Marius assumed command in 107 BC. In the period after the defeat of Carthage in 201 BC, the army was campaigning exclusively outside Italy, resulting in its men being away from their home plots of land for many years at a stretch. They were assuaged by the large amounts of booty that they shared after victories in the rich Eastern theatre. But in Italy, the ever-increasing concentration of public lands in the hands of big landowners, and the consequent displacement of the soldiers' families, led to great unrest and demands for land redistribution. This led to the mass revolt of the Socii and the Social War. The result was the grant of Roman citizenship to all Italians in the end of the Polybian army's dual structure. The Alii were abolished and the Socii recruited into the legions.